Welcome to Healing Through Play Therapy podcast, where we explore a wide range of topics related to children's mental health. I'm your host, Szilvi, an experienced certified play therapist. I'm a passionate advocate for the well-being of children and families. With years of experience in non-profit organizations, schools, and clinical settings, I will bring a collection of interesting topics that could be valuable for families, schools, and other settings working with children. Today, we have a very special guest joining us, Naomi Moore, who brings valuable insight into today's challenging topic. Naomi is a play and creative arts therapist and clinical supervisor who works with children and young people in primary, secondary, and special schools in private practice. She had been one of the leaders of the weekend volunteer program at Great Ormond Street Hospital for 6 years, which provides play and creative fun for sick children and their families. She was a volunteer for 4 years before and has previously worked in the Red Cross Children's Hospital in South Africa. Naomi has many professional interests, including the emotional well-being of neurodivergent children in mainstream education, children with complex needs and medical conditions, siblings, self-harm, eating disorders, and trauma and dissociation. She also teaches as part of the Wellbeing faculty at the Institute for Arts in Therapy and Education for the Sunflower Network and Jigsaw Academy. In today's episode, we are discussing the complex issue of self-harm in autistic children. When self-harm intersects with autism, it poses unique challenges for both the child and their caregivers. Naomi will share her expertise regarding this sensitive topic to provide a deeper understanding of self-harm in autistic children and to explore how play therapy can offer support to both children and their families. Hello, Naomi. Welcome to our first podcast, and thank you for agreeing to do this podcast.
Very glad to be here.
My very first question would be, what are some common reasons behind self-harming behaviours in autistic children?
Big topic to start with. I think just before we start with the topic of self-harm, I would just like to say to anybody listening, obviously self-harm is a very emotive topic, and it might be that you are a parent of a child who is self-harming or you have self-harmed in the past. And just to remind everybody that to prioritise self-care when listening to this conversation, and that might mean turning the conversation off or doing it in smaller bits that you can manage with, but make sure you keep yourself safe whilst we're talking. For anyone out there who is questioning whether I should be talking about this topic in terms of self-harm and neurodivergence, I'm quite happy for people to know that I'm both neurodivergent and I used to self-harm. This is a topic I know from both professional and personal experience. And going back to Sylvie's question in terms of, what about self-harm? First of all, I think we need to differentiate between self-harming behaviour and self-injurious behaviour. Self-harm is the deliberate attempt to harm themselves, to inflict pain on yourself, whereas self-injurious behaviour, which is often also seen in autistic children, can often come under the same label as self-harm, depending on who's defining it. That's behaviour that injures the self and does cause harm to the self, but without the intention necessarily of the child to do that. So here I might be referring more to head banging or hair pulling. However, there can be overlap, quite significant overlap between these. So sometimes it can be very, very hard to decide which category it falls into. And at the end of the day, suppose in some ways we still have a child who's in need of support, and what they're both communicating is dysregulation and distress. With autistic children and self-harm, a significant number of the reasons why autistic children might self-harm are exactly the same as the reasons that neurotypical children might self-harm. But some may also be linked specifically to the experience of being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. Some of the reasons that children and young people may self-harm generally are when whatever it is they're going through feels too overwhelming, and the self-harm can serve as a release for this impossible feelings that they have inside of them that they may not feel that they can communicate in any other way. Some children would like to inflict harm on themselves because they might want to punish themselves. Maybe they don't like themselves very much. Maybe they're being bullied and it's a response to that. There can be so many reasons why children might engage in self-harm. And we also have to consider the influence as well today, especially of social media, and how children might come into contact with self-harm through that, or also being around friends who self-harm. And there may be instances of copycat behaviour. However, just because a child is copying a behaviour doesn't necessarily mean that it's any less serious.
How can you differentiate when it's somebody is copying a friend or they truly mean the self-harm?
That's why I think it's important not to make that judgment. I personally, when I'm working with children and young people, even if it's been said to me, because often things are said in referral like, oh, their best friend started self-harming and now they're doing it. I personally prefer to suspend judgment at that point and just meet the child or young person completely as they are and understand from their point of view what's going on. Because I think it can very easily get into a very judgmental realm when we start talking about copycat behaviours and thinking as to why, and then it inevitably goes down the route of thinking, well, attention seeking. And I always encourage people when thinking about self-harm, what if we replace the word attention with attachment? What if we saw it as an attachment-seeking behaviour? The question is, what is this child trying to communicate that they need at this particular point in time? And that may well be contact, attention, whatever we want to call it. Having a need for attention is a human need. Some children may feel they have to go to extreme lengths to get that contact. So I'm just thinking about autistic children in particular. When you grow up as an autistic child or neurodivergent child, this can also apply to different forms of neurodivergence, you may end up growing up in a world where you always feel different. And worse than that, you may also feel wrong because you might not fit in as easily as other children seem to do. Things might feel more complex. You might spend a lot of time getting into trouble for simply being the way you are. For example, I work with an autistic young lady who, when she speaks, she's very direct in the way that she communicates, which is often interpreted as rude. Consequently, she spends a lot of time being told off for the way that she says things. And she doesn't mean to be rude, but she does deliver things very directly. So consequently, she has a belief that she is a terrible person who can't say anything right, because a significant amount of adults, when responding to her, the first thing they do is tell her off for the way that she's communicated something. And her self-harm developed out of this belief that because of the way that she communicates, she is a terrible person. Obviously, there's different work you have to do there on different levels. Being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world can be extremely stressful. Stress, worry, and traumatic experiences can be very common reasons for self-harm in anybody. Something I like to consider with neurodivergent children is the idea of that actually just being in the world, living in the world as a neurodivergent person can actually be incredibly traumatic.
Would you say some children obviously start self-harming because they just can't accept that they're different from typically developing children, and it's just put so much stress on them that they either punish themselves with self-harm or from the pain that they excluded from the social environment in the schools, nurseries, they do self-harm?
And maybe elements of that to it. There is another way of looking at this as well, and that is that the world is simply not geared to be able to meet a lot of our neurodivergent children's needs. In a way, it's not the child themselves that has the problem. It's the fact that they're constantly being put in environments and having expectations put on them that they are simply not able to meet. So in a way, there's the situation, the mental health needs to presenting grow out of the fact that we are continually putting children into those situations, and then we're labeling them and saying, well, this child's got this and this child's got that, or this child's doing this, when actually there is very little conversation around how the environments and how the systems within those environments might be contributing to this. And I think this is a really big topic when talking about neurodivergent children, because obviously especially if you look at the special educational needs system, in order to get a child's support, we're always thinking of it in terms of deficits. Where are they struggling? What are they not good at? And when you write the reports to be able to help get a child support, you're always focusing on those things, but we don't always consider the impact that has, not just on a child, but also on a family as well. Thinking of sitting in those meetings, listening to professionals say things about your child. And those things may, in some instances, and not all, may also end up being communicated to the child. We can't underestimate the level of the traumatic experience of being a neurodivergent child for some children, because none of what I say can be generalised to all neurodivergent children. And I wouldn't want to ever do that. So what I'm saying here, I'm speaking very, very generally, and people may or may not relate to that. Being around others who self-harm can be a challenge for any child, but sometimes I've noticed, especially when I've been working with autistic girls, this seems to be a problem because they want to be like their friend, and sometimes they can find it very difficult to separate themselves from their friends. So I often have they'll say to me, but because they're doing this, then I have to do it too because we're friends. You have to then sort of unpick this.
Would you say that girls more prone to self-harm than boys, or is just a vague generalization?
The research does suggest that more autistic girls self-harm than boys. However, I'm also seeing a lot of autistic boys who self-harm. We also need to consider things like sensory overwhelm or underwhelm, because self-harm can be a way that a child reacts to a sensory systems, their sensory systems that have been completely overloaded. And in some cases, I've also had autistic children whose sensory system underwhelmed, and self-harm can become a means of sort of in a way relieving that boredom. I can have very open conversations with young people I work with about they were bored. Now, bearing in mind as well, bored can have many different meanings. So sometimes it's important not to take necessarily that at face value. If a child ever says to you, is that because I was bored? What does bored actually mean? So here we're thinking of our iceberg. Now, this is the insert board at the top of the iceberg, and then underneath think of all the things that bored could mean, because that can be another way of supporting children to get to. And also thinking about transitions. Transitions sometimes for autistic children can be extremely stressful. Transitions, or sometimes even the thought of a transition, might be a trigger for self-harm.
How can play therapy help autistic children develop alternative coping mechanisms? What do you think would be the way to help these children to replace self-harming behaviors?
I must admit, I never set out in therapy for a child to stop self-harming behaviours. I'm aware that can be quite a controversial view, because understandably there is a lot of emphasis on people, because from my point of view, the self-harm is a symptom. It's a symptom of an underlying dysregulation in the central nervous system. It's a symptom of distress. I personally prefer to really sort of try and understand the self-harm, be able to support children to be able to regulate before I sort of think about this has to stop. And this can be a difficult viewpoint for some people. Some people just want the behaviour stopped at all costs. I personally don't believe in ever taking a symptom away or trying to sort of moderate a symptom until you've actually supported a child to develop other ways around it, and then they make the choice. So thinking of it from the play therapy point of view, Axeline's principle, the responsibility to make change and instigate that change is actually the child's. That's my personal viewpoint on it. It does raise important questions, does this, in terms of can you stop a child self-harming? I know people who've claimed to, and what's happened is the child has simply found other ways to self-harm and not told anybody about them.
As a play therapist myself, thinking about the parent, obviously the parents come to you, they share with you that, oh, my child is self-harming, can you please help my child? And then obviously we do tell parents that therapy is a process. It's not like we have a magic wand and we're going to fix the child within 4 or 5 sessions. What would you tell to a parent who would say, look, you've been working with my child for, I don't know, for a few more months, and actually my child is still self-harming. You're not doing your job. I want you to stop it.
I'll get to that bit when we're talking about involving the family, but that is a very good point, because understand what we're really dealing with here is whose agenda are we following with. I've had young people who walk into my room, or autistic young people, and the first thing they say to me is, if you want me to stop self-harming, then I won't. Thank you very much for making your position clear to me. I can hear from what you're saying that you have a belief that you're coming here for me to make you stop self-harming. And this, of course, then leads you into a whole discussion. What does self-harm mean to them? What is it about it that they don't want to give up? There is a lot of pressure on practitioners. You have raised a very good point in that there is a lot of pressure on practitioners where self-harm is concerned to just stop the behaviour, just shut it down immediately. This, in my experience, doesn't work, either personally or professionally.
So when we're thinking about to obviously involve the family, how are you involving the family in this healing process?
Oh, obviously, the family are the one usually who refers the child to. I'd be working with them from the outset. The first things I'm very, very curious about, and I'm curious about this from the point of view of the child, and I'm curious also very much so from the family, is what do they think the self-harm is about? Are there patterns that anybody has noticed? Because there often are. Does it always happen after a certain thing? Are there certain triggers that people have noticed? These are things that I'm very curious to know. How aware is the child of their own triggers? I get a range of children, from children who are very aware to children who are alexithymic and simply couldn't tell me. I want to know things like, what does the child find helpful, if anything? They might not know at that point. You might not have got to that point yet where they're developing. What does the child find helpful? And then if I'm thinking about alternative coping strategies for a minute, what I'd be looking at is any of the self-regulatory tools that we can teach to children, depending on what that child needs at the time. But one thing I always say to the child and to the parent is that no strategy works every time. I can teach any number of self-regulation strategies, and it might be that when a child is in that state, they are not able to use them. This can develop over time. And my attitude towards this with the child is always one of, they'll tell me, I was going to try, but then it overtook me and it just happened. And to explore that with them, and then to keep letting them try this rather than think, I failed, this doesn't work, I'm rubbish. But when you get to involving the family, most often you have your first contact with the family, the parents or the carers especially. I think family are key to understanding from their perspective. I do like to get as much as possible a sort of a 360 perspective on the child. And I like to note where there are any discrepancies or anything. The child says this, but the mum says this, but the dad says this. And that sort of thing is very interesting to me, just from the point of view of I'm trying to put the pieces together to try and work out what's going on for this child. So then the child and I can work together, and the parents, to find ways to support this child. That's the ultimate aim of the work. So the family are absolutely key to this. Also, bearing in mind, when a parent's just discovered their child's self-harming, your child is harming themselves. That is pretty much one of the most horrible things you can discover as a parent, and especially if you don't know anything about self-harm, you've not come across it before, and suddenly you've got this in front of you. It's understandable that a parent is going to have a lot of very big feelings about this, and they can be anything from absolute despair, distress, to outright anger and fury. And my belief, just like with children, whatever emotion is being expressed is exactly what it is, and it's welcome, and we're going to work with it. The parents and the carers deal with the child all of the time, so we need them. Yeah, we need them probably a lot more than they need us, dare I say it. When I'm talking to the parent, I would want to know exactly the questions that I spoke about before. I'd want to know also, though, how they reacted to this. Rather than just firing questions at parents, I'm probably making it sound like I do that. We also as well have to also feel it from the parent's perspective, whether or not we agree with anything they've said. 99.9% of parents I've spoken with are doing the absolute best they can, often under very difficult circumstances. So one thing I would be seeking to think about with them is, are there any pattern in the dynamics between the sort of parent and child that might be sustaining the self-harm in some way? By that question, I'm not saying blaming. That's a conclusion a lot of people often come to. But the thing is, when you witness your child harm themselves, it's horrific for the parent. And most parents would do absolutely anything to make that stop. For some, this can lead to a situation that there can be an element of sort of coercive control that comes into play, where everybody is tiptoeing on eggshells around this child because they do not want them to self-harm. To be honest, I have neurotypical and neurodivergent children on my client list who would do this and would speak quite openly about it. That it's become something that they can use as leverage within the family. That's not to diminish in any way the actual distress that's being communicated. And that's why self-harm is so complex. It can lead to so many complex dynamics, but underneath that, you've always got the underlying distress. So for me, when I come across a child who appears to be using self-harm in this way, and obviously I wouldn't make no assumption about that until I start to notice the patterns, or something becomes clear, or the child says something, or the parent says something. What I'm thinking of here is a child who has a very strong need to be in control. So my question is, what is going on in their life that they don't feel in control of? Why would you need And that might be anything. And it might be things that you can't do anything about. It might be an acting out of how they might feel coerced and controlled in the situations. I know for a lot of autistic children I work with find school incredibly difficult. And then when they go home, the family gets the brunt of that difficulty because the child is able to mask, they're able to sort of hide how they feel for most of the day in school. And this is especially true for my autistic girls. And if I asked anybody in school about them, people would say, oh, no, they're lovely, they're fine. But then I'm getting reports from a parent saying this child is in total meltdown at home from the minute they get home. And that doesn't sound to me like a child who's coping. That sounds to me like a child who's masking.
It sounds like a child who holds it in so much during the day to not have a meltdown in school and then obviously takes that home. And that's what the parents see.
And actually, that particular young lady feels completely out of control all day. And then when she goes home, she becomes extremely controlling in every way because she's desperately trying to hold on to something that she can control because she actually doesn't feel in control of anything. I would also be educating the family. So I use quite a lot of psychoeducation if I can. And then what I'd like the parents to do is help me because I can give them a theory. I can give them any number of theories. But what I can't do is be able to say how that theory relates to their child. That's where I need their help. So this is teamwork. I can teach about self-harm, can talk about the window of tolerance. So those are my big ones that I work with. So the window of tolerance as applied to self-harm. Self-harm is most likely to happen when a child is dysregulated. So they've either become hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. We've got two different sort of ends of the spectrum here. So with self-harm, a child who becomes hyper-aroused might be the type of child where they feel the build-up of the tension. It builds up and up and up and up and up and up and up, and then the self-harm serves to release that. In terms of hypoarousal, these are the children where everything is shut down. They can often be very dissociated. So again, thinking of a child who might be masking all day, they might be very shut down. And then the self-harm might be to try and end that state of feeling nothing, of feeling numb. For children who are alexithymic and are not able to easily identify emotions or may feel they don't have any, this might be something that's key to consider here. And some children can vacillate between the two. It's not to say that just because a child is sometimes hyper-aroused does not mean that they can't also become hypo-aroused. And self-harm may serve different functions depending on what states they're in. So I actually do get the window of tolerance out for parents. I do explain it to them. We talk about the brain when it gets actually overwhelmed and distressed, and what happens there and how the child is then being driven from there. We also talk about the fear responses that come in. So a child being driven from their limbic system will have a very emotional response. But also if a child feels under threat in any way, we're then talking about the reptilian brain because their brain is identified as threat. Now that threat might be you've simply said as a parent, oh, we need to go to the shop on the way home to pick up this, and your autistic child was not expecting that. Transitions might come under the umbrella of something that's seen as very threatening. So I do like to talk about this with parents. I also like to talk about what I've just said as well, the pathways to self-harm in terms of what exactly is the self-harm serving? Is it serving to release something? Is it serving to try and bring about any feeling? Or is it, and in terms of the attachment needs as well, what is it trying to communicate? And I'm really interested in the parents' views on this because my job is also in this instance is to be able to obviously take a parent who's often extremely dysregulated, as a parent would be, whose child is self-harming, and also try and support them to be able to process that, to be able to really think about it and to think together about strategies that might work for that child. So we need to involve the family as much as we can. There may be instances where that's not possible for all sorts of reasons, but in terms of in an ideal world, I would really want the family on board as much as possible.
Are there any red flags or warning signs that parents and caregivers should be aware of when it comes to self-harm? Obviously, I'm talking about signs that are not obvious, but is there anything in behaviors change, if you could say something about that?
What I would say is parents know their child well. So I often encourage parents to think of, has their behaviour changed in any way from your child's norm? So a parent might notice that a child might have become more withdrawn. With self-harm, you might get more secretive behaviours. Especially if the self-harm is sort of harming their body, they might suddenly not want you to see them naked, or they might suddenly become intensely preoccupied with their own privacy. And some of this can be developmentally not. So around the time that a lot of self-harm can develop, which is sort of teen, secondary school age, not always though, we're seeing it more and more in younger children. That's a time where children might become more self-conscious anyway. The red flags can be very hard to spot. The amount of parents who've said to me in my career, but why didn't I notice? And they really beat themselves up over that. Sometimes it is very, very difficult to notice, especially because it creeps up over time. Other red flags to be aware of is children talking in sort of quite negative terms about themselves. I'm rubbish, I'm stupid. I've never heard a child use the word worthless, but anything that conveys something like that. There is a very high link between autism and emotionally based school avoidance. If I'm working with a young person or child who's emotionally based school avoidance, that for me is a red flag, because that tells me that the school situation is absolutely unbearable for them. I also know that where there's often emotionally based school avoidance, there can often be a lot of conflict. Because obviously, all parents are told, if you're a good parent, you get your child into school. But there's many, many reasons why, or to some autistic children, that school actually might be, psychologically very harmful. Things like that. And also, if the child's spending a lot of time on their own in their room, again, these are places where self-harm can develop. From the point of view of a lot of the autistic girls that I work with, I'm also curious about their masking, because masking can be incredibly dangerous in this instance, because a lot of children and young people I know are so adept at just pretending everything's fine that you just wouldn't consider self-harm until it's in front of you. Sometimes you get children who give you absolutely no red flags whatsoever, because it's actually the masking that is the red flag. One thing I always encourage any parent to do, if you are concerned in any way about your child, any threat to saying, I want to end my life, I want to kill myself, then that is the point where you definitely need to seek external support. So anybody who's concerned about their child's safety, immediate safety, personally recommend going to A&E. This communicates sort of two things. One, it involves trying to alert statutory services that this child needs help. Secondly, it communicates to your child that actually you're taking this seriously. It might not be a level of serious that they necessarily want you to take. I wouldn't necessarily expect to be thanked for it, but it can be important. We're also very aware at the moment it is a lot harder for autistic children to access mental health services.
What would you say was the reason for that autistic children access to mental health support harder?
It's hard for me to say, because I don't work for statutory services, so I don't necessarily understand the thinking behind it. I think there can be a real challenge, especially for autistic children, with something that can be perceived as lack of engagement or non-compliance. I do question that, because I spend a lot of my time working with autistic young people, and I've personally never had a problem with engagement at all. However, it can take a lot longer for autistic children to be able to engage in therapeutic work. It takes a long time to trust sometimes. The behaviour there can be, in terms of thinking, in terms of black and white thinking, often self-harming behaviours and things can become very entrenched very quickly, and it can be hard to change. The child might not want to change at that particular moment in time. From my point of view, that's my problem to work with, the therapist. But I know a lot of parents of autistic children have experienced significant difficulties getting support for their children, which is a shame, because there is a lot of children out there who are in desperate need of support. There can be discrimination in the therapeutic field sometimes with some practitioners as to where a child has a diagnosis of autism. Some practitioners don't feel able or equipped or believe the service they offer is suitable. And I can't account for that thinking.
So if we go back to the main topic, what do you think how play therapy could help children, not just autistic children, but children and young people, to reduce self-harm tendencies?
I think what play therapy or any type of therapy, the more sort of humanistic and integrative ones that aren't specifically focused on a certain thing, can do is it can give a space to a child to process what's going on for them. And often children don't always know what's going on for them. It helps to support them to understand themselves. In terms of play and creative arts, for those of us who are playing creative arts trained, playing creative arts can provide another avenue. Children and young people don't have to be able to talk about things. And for an autistic child, this may be a better way for them to be able to process what's going on for them, because not all children, as we all very well know, are necessarily able to do that verbally. And where you get a child where autism intersects with alexithymia, which is where a child can have real difficulty understanding, managing, and communicating about their feelings. Obviously, therapy is extremely stressful when you're alexithymic, because you've got someone saying, "How does that make you feel?" Don't know. So sometimes when you get a child and they're autistic and they're saying, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know," it's maybe it is they don't know. Therapy can be very stressful for some children.
So how can you reach these children?
Now, there are many other ways that you can support them. And this is why I love the sort of playing creative arts, because often they do the work for you. As we very well know, when we're working with children through play, children will go where they need to go if you've got a good supportive therapist. And they can do that in ways that the child doesn't even know they're doing it. It's completely unconscious. And then we can also support the child to sort of bring things into the conscious. But this has to be done quite carefully with any child, not just autistic children, so we don't accidentally flood them. That can be particularly complicated because actually that can be quite frightening, and it also is overwhelming. We need to be able to sort of titrate our interventions, support, so that a child's able to manage it. And that will be different for every child. Like I say, for everything, I never really give a sort of blanket, these are things you can do with all children. So that's how play therapy can help. I mean, there's so many ways that play therapy can help that I don't believe you can be completely communicated in total. I think the best judge of sort of whether something's working for a child is, I mean, firstly, whether it's the child is engaging with it and wanting to go. I think that's very important. I think play therapy and any of the therapies will be able to help your child develop a range of supportive techniques the child can draw on. I personally don't necessarily have specific activities that I would do, not straight away. Anyway, what I would do is, first of all, I give the space over to the child. It's a child-led session. And I obviously let children know. Then they can choose whether or not they engage with that. And if a child wants to engage with their self-harm, I have had children come in and say, "I want to learn how to stop self-harming." That's fantastic. That's the child's choice, because you can then work on specific strategies. You can support them. I often use psychoeducation with children as well, just like I would with parents. I talk about the window of tolerance. We talk about their window of tolerance. We talk about self-harm cycles and pathways to self-harm, and they can identify sort of what's going on for them, because there is power in the knowledge. It supports children to understand themselves. And I think having a space where children are able to communicate as much as they can in whatever way they can about what is going on for them is something that also leads them to a greater understanding of themselves, which is ultimately what I'm hoping for.
My last question is, what advice would you give to parents, caregivers and educators seeking to support autistic children or any child who's struggling with self-harm behaviours?
I think just some general advice would first be to acknowledge your own feelings about self-harm, whatever they might be. People can have very different feelings about it. So I would acknowledge anybody to first just be able to acknowledge, what does it bring up for you? Because that's your starting point. It's okay to have all of those feelings. Self-harm can bring up a lot of very difficult feelings for people. It is a very emotive topic. First of all, what you've got is a child who, obviously is in need of support. That's what their behaviour is communicating. Be empathic to the child. Try not to just label what they're doing as attention seeking or whatever you might feel it is, because we don't ever know that. I've worked with self-harm for a very long time. I always start from the premise with any child of, I know a lot of theories and I know a lot of techniques and I know a lot of, but one thing I really don't know about is that particular child. That's what I'm open to. Show support. And one good way to do this, and what can be very empowering, is to ask the child how they might like to be supported. And they might not know. Some of them might give you an answer that you don't like as well. And because actually accepting help and accepting support can feel very scary. And for some autistic children, it might feel even scarier because it's new and it might mean change. And those things can be extremely difficult. So try and understand what the child is communicating, and also try and understand that they might not be able to. They're not necessarily being difficult. They're not just throwing your offer back in their face. They genuinely might not have the emotional vocabulary to be able to really communicate it to you. In terms of safety, it is useful to, if they have immediate access to things that they can use to harm themselves, remove them. However, and there's a big however here, children can and will, if they want to self-harm, find something else. Be creative in your thinking. And obviously, in some situations, it's just not possible to remove everything. So your obvious things are sort of anything really sharp, like knives, right, or something. However, there are other objects that can be used and people can be very creative. Please bear in mind that whilst you might do that, that will not solve the problem. That's just about sort of safety in the immediate. If the child needs medical support, seek it. If the child, if you think they need therapeutic support, which they most likely will, look for a therapist who understands neurodivergence and self-harm, and not all do. Have a think about the underlying reasons and be honest about this, because sometimes, much as we all don't like to think it, we can be the underlying issue. So in school, this can be a bit complex around thinking of how the school environment might contribute. There might be things going on in the home that might be contributing. Have a think of what are the underlying reasons why this behaviour is here from your point of view. And the child can help with this, or like you said, again, they might not know. The other thing that's a bit more controversial is thinking about social media, checking your child's social media. Are they accessing content that might be fueling this? Is there any cyberbullying going on that you don't know about? In the ideal circumstances, you'd have the child's consent and you'd sit with the child and go through their social media together. However, I'm also very much aware that that's not always possible. But in terms of safety, this is something that I would be doing as a safeguarding issue, and I'd sort of do it quite openly. And what doesn't help, I have to give the doesn'ts, is taking all control away. It's really understandable that adults in that situation want to absolutely panic and they want to sort of put in all sorts of controls to make the situation feel more safer and more manageable. And some of those may be reasonable, but some of them also may not be and might make the situation worse. So taking all control away doesn't necessarily work. Neither does demanding that the self-harm stop at all costs, or offering bribes or things to sort of stop a child or young person self-harming. Because if the underlying need for self-harm is there, then what happens if the child uses that as a coping strategy again? They're going to think they've failed. And this can activate feelings of shame, failure, self-hatred, all the things that we do not want them to feel, because that's actually going to feed into the cycle. So whilst it can be tempting to demand they stop at all costs, and I'm also including here using emotional blackmail to make children stop. So there I'm talking about the things that can be said, the best of intentions and the heat of the moment of, it makes me so sad and so upset when I see what you've done to yourself. That's never made anybody stop, but I can understand why you'd want to say it. Simply ignoring injuries or overly focusing on them. Some people think self-harm's best ignored, and then if you just ignore it, it will go away. I've never found any evidence to support that necessarily. Or focusing on them entirely and just missing the child, because often when a child's self-harming, people completely forget about the child. Everybody's focusing on this behaviour, but not on the not on the issues behind it, not on the actual child. So always trying to keep the child centre as the child, not the behaviour. And also making assumptions about why a child is self-harming, what purpose it serves. Whilst these are really good things to think about and to consider, I personally think it's unhelpful to go for sort of blanket assumptions And then most of all, as a parent, anybody who's involved in this, make sure you look after yourself, because you need to be there to be able to support your child. Very hard to do that if you're not able to make sure you've got the right care you need as well.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for sharing your insights about self-harm. It was a very interesting discussion. And I do hope everybody else who listens to this podcast will find it interesting and useful as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.